Hello class, and welcome back to our discussion on the American Revolution. Just want to remind you that when we talk about the American Revolution, we're talking about the bigger picture, not just the war for independence. However, this video and a few videos after this, we will be focusing on the war for independence. After all, that's a very important part of the American Revolution. Still, there are things that are happening during this war that are still part of the bigger revolutionary picture. So whenever you see something that has to do with change, whether it's society changing, politics changing, culture changing, pay attention to those things, because that is part of what makes the American Revolution revolutionary. Another thing I want to mention before we get into this lesson, it is going to take several videos to cover the war for independence. However, even doing that, we're not going to talk about every battle of the American Revolution. There's simply too many battles to really get into. So what I've tried to do is pick some key battles that play an important part of the story. And that's not to degrade any other battles that happened or say that the people who fought in those battles don't matter, but just to compile a narrative for this class, which is a survey class, right? We're not getting, this isn't a class just on the American Revolution. So we are going to overlook a lot of the conflict itself while maintaining a narrative of what happened. All right, now that said, there's still a lot of battles that we are going to talk about. So you are going to need to pay attention to those battles, why those battles are important, who the commanders were of those battles. So when we talk about a battle, you might want to know who commanded the Americans there, who commanded the British there, or whoever, right? Depending on the battle, there may not have been any British people there. And you may be wondering, well, how are there no British people in a battle during the American Revolution? And we'll address that when we get to it. But anyway, so the war began, right? When we last left off, we were dealing with this political tension, all right? There was all of those revenue acts, like the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, and we saw the tension building between the American colonists and Great Britain. And when it ended, the last thing we really talked about was the coercive acts or the intolerable acts. And if you remember, these were specific to Massachusetts. And we also mentioned that the First Continental Congress met and discussed these intolerable acts and what to do. And one of the things that the First Continental Congress suggested was that the colonies should start preparing their militias. All right, so what we see between the Intolerable Acts in 1774 and 1775 is a preparedness by the colonies. And so we start to see the colonists getting accountability of their weapons, gunpowder, and ammunition. We see the colonists training. We see the colonists organizing in a military fashion. Now, this is not technically wrong. Each colony had militia laws, right? If you remember, we go back all the way to Jamestown. Until the French and Indian War, no one protected the colonies. The colonies protected themselves. So when they fought the Pequot War and the Anglo-Powhatan Wars and King Philip's War and King William's War and all those wars that we talked about in Section 1, it was the colonists fighting those wars. And so the colonists had laws in place to ensure they had a military defense. And these were the militia laws. And it basically required every man between the age of 16 and 60 to serve. And so every male colonist, or at least I would say every free male colonist, was armed and maintained a gun, not just because they wanted to, but because they were required to by law. And so what they're doing here in response to the Intolerable Acts is not technically illegal. However, it does get the attention of Great Britain because the main two threats that we had seen, especially in Massachusetts, over the last century and a half, was either a French threat or an Indian threat. And both of those threats have been removed by Great Britain. The French aren't here anymore because they lost the French and Indian War. And the Indians have really been pushed west of the Appalachian Mountains. So from a British perspective, there is no need for these colonists to be preparing for war unless they intend to go to war with Britain itself, which would be rebellion, right? And so Britain becomes concerned about this, and they decide to take action. Now, one of the places that's important to our story, now, all the colonies are doing this, but we're sort of focused on Massachusetts right now because that's where the Intolerable Acts are. And the colonists are, they have in a place called Concord, Massachusetts. Concord's about 20 miles from Boston. And so in Concord, they have some gunpowder and some bullets, and they have a few cannons there. And cannons are important because the colonists don't really have cannons. It's one thing for every man to own a gun or two. It's not common for people to own artillery pieces like cannons. But the colonists do have a few cannons, and they have them in Massachusetts, in Concord. And so Britain decides that they need to remove this. All right. So intelligence reaches the colonists that Britain plans to take these cannons. And so the colonists are aware of this. They're planning for it. And on April 18th, 1775, Britain lands a force in Boston. Now, if you remember, the Intolerable Acts are in place, so Boston, Massachusetts is already under martial law. There's already British troops in Massachusetts. But this is a force being landed for the purpose of marching to Concord and confiscating these weapons. And the colonists believe, or at least some of them believe, that this is an infringement on their natural rights, their liberty. The right to bear arms, something that we have in our Constitution, is sort of connected back to this. And so the colonists believe without a means to defend themselves that they're not truly free men. And so this is the final straw. This is the breaking point of the colonists, where they go from protesters to rebels. They become violent. And so when the British force lands on the night of April 18th, there is a response by the colonists. And so this is probably where you've heard of the famous midnight ride of Paul Revere. And that is what happens. Paul Revere runs around alerting the militia to get ready. There's a lot of myth involved with that too, mostly based on a poem written, way later. But Paul Revere does help alert the colonial militia that the British have landed a force. He is not the only midnight rider. Okay, there are others such as these William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, but even those, there's more. These guys are riding, and then they're telling people, and then those people are getting on horses and they're telling people. So this is not one man alerting Massachusetts. This is a network of riders alerting all of the militiamen in the colony. Okay, so by the next morning, all right, so as morning comes and we shift days, so it is now April 19th, 1775, this British force is made it to the village of Lexington. Now, Lexington's about 12 miles from Boston, all right? So again, the British have landed in Boston. They're making their way towards Concord, and they have to pass through this village called Lexington. These British are commanded by a man named Francis Smith. That was on the last slide, and I didn't mention it, but Francis Smith is in charge of this operation. When he makes it to Lexington, he finds about 80 soldiers assembled in Lexington. When I say soldiers, I mean militia, colonial militia. All right, about 80 of them assembled in Lexington. And again, he has to pass through Lexington to get to Concord. Now, these villagers in Lexington are there. They have their muskets with them, but they're really just sort of demonstrating, all right, that they are free men and they are armed. They're not there really with the intention to fight, but a fight does break out. And so one of the British officers, under Smith, approaches these militiamen, and he orders them to basically lay down their guns and leave. They do not lay down their guns, and from somewhere, we are not sure who, someone fired a shot. They possibly even fired more than one shot. We don't really know, but we do know that somebody started shooting, and if it was one shot, this is the shot that is referred to as the shot heard round the world, because when this shot was fired, of course, the British fired their weapons, and the Americans did as well. And this was the opening shots of the American War for Independence. Now, I'm loosely saying that because these colonists are not fighting for independence. They don't know what they're fighting for. This is not planned. This is, it's cause and effect, right? So violence has now begun. Killing has begun. They're not fighting for independence. They really don't even know who's in charge because, again, this was just at the local level. This was assembled. These are militiamen. 8 Americans get killed. About 10 are wounded. Only one British guy gets wounded in this. The Americans basically, disperse, and the British continue marching towards Concord. When they get to Concord, they do find some of those military supplies that were stockpiled there, including some cannons, and they destroy the cannons basically by destroying the carriage to the cannons, the thing that actually makes the cannons mobile. And then they take a bunch of supplies like food and bullets and things like that, and they dump them in a pond. And so basically the British have accomplished what they came to do, but while this is going on, more Americans are continuing to rally, to assemble from all across New England. They have now heard about the villagers at Lexington being fired upon and killed, and they have made their way to Concord. They see smoke from the fire that the British are using to destroy these cannons, and the colonists attack the British. So the Americans are going to attack the British outside of Concord at a bridge. Now the colonists outnumber the British, and the British start retreating back to Boston. Now again, it's about 20 miles, so 20 miles on foot. It's a pretty long way. And while they're retreating to Boston, so covering this 20 miles, the whole time they're getting attacked. Colonists keep showing up, and they're firing at the British. At first, it was a little more organized, where it was sort of the militiamen were in their ranks. But as this goes on, as the British retreat back towards Boston, they start getting shot at by people coming in from behind trees, from behind fences, and it's basically an assault on the British Army all the way back to Boston. The British Army is one of the best in the world. It's very well trained, but it's having a problem with this because there's not an army there to fight. What they're fighting is a population of armed Americans. And so all they can really do is sort of fight and run back to Boston. And when they get back to Boston, basically the Americans have them trapped. And so this ends with an American victory. So the Battle of Lexington and Concord is the first battle, so to speak. We'll call it the first battle of the American War for Independence. But again, they're not fighting for independence yet. It's just hostilities have now broken out. But they've run the British back to Boston and then laid siege to Boston. So the Americans now have the British Army sort of trapped on the coast at Boston. And we'll see what happens with that as we move forward. All right, so this is our opening battle. All right, now again, this is April 19th. Okay, so this is going to call another meeting of Congress. So this is what we're going to call the Second Continental Congress. It's the second meeting of the colonies. Notice the dates on this one. Now this is May 10th, 1775 to March 1st, 1781. So this meeting of Congress will last until the end of the war. In fact, this is going to be the government of the United States. There's no president. There's no federal government as we think of it today. So this is the government now of the United States. Now, they're not called the United States because they haven't declared independence. So this is really just the government of the colonies who are now united, so to speak, against Britain. Also, the date May 10th, 1775. So they have responded to Lexington and Concord and met here in Philadelphia to have this meeting. This is a very fast response. If you take into account that during this time, there is no modern modes of transportation. There's no modern means of communication. Messages had to be delivered, by hand, either by someone walking, riding a horse, or taking a ship. And so for Congress to meet this soon after Lexington and Concord is pretty significant. A month later, so June 14th, 1775, Congress votes to create a Continental Army. All right, so that word Continental keeps popping up. First Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress, and now Continental Army. This is what we would think of as, the U.S. Congress or the U.S. Army. But there is no U.S., there's no United States. But we're calling this a Continental Army because the idea is it's comprised of men from all of the colonies. So this is not a New Jersey Army, it's not a Massachusetts Army, it is an American Army. So it is therefore a Continental Army. There's men from Georgia, there's men from South Carolina, there's men from Virginia, there's men from New York, all serving in this army, or eventually will serve. So when this army is created, this Continental Army is established, June 14th, 1775, it is basically the guys who have besieged Boston, who are now surrounding Boston. That's what's going to become the army. And eventually the other colonies are going to contribute to this army. Now, to lead this army, they need a man who has military experience and who seems capable of leading an army. And that guy is going to be George Washington. So George Washington is going to be the commander of the Continental Army. Now, this is a controversial pick. George Washington has demonstrated during the French and Indian War that he is capable of military leadership. He was on the Forbes expedition. He was on the Battle of Monongahela, which was a failure, but he was sort of a hero of that battle, despite it was a British loss. So Washington has experience. However, there are other men on the Patriot side, on the American side, who are former British officers. All right, so let me clarify that real quick, okay? In the French and Indian War, George Washington was on the British side. He was on the side of Great Britain. However, he was an American officer. He was what we call a provincial officer. So he was an officer of the colony of Virginia, serving on the British side because Virginia was a British colony. There are other men in the American Army who were British officers, meaning they were officers of the British Army of Great Britain. In this time period, in the British Empire, Great Britain emphasized that their officers, the British officers, were better than provincial officers. So as a result, there are many people in America who would have looked at George Washington and said, he's not a good choice because we have some men that are better. We have some better options because these men were British officers. All right. So why did they go with George Washington? Well, George Washington's from the South. All right. He's from Virginia. He's from one of the southern colonies. As of right now, everything that's sort of been happening in this war is happening in the north. Right now it's kind of a New England conflict. I mean, we've only had the Battle of Lexington and Concord for the most part, and that's a northern thing. And some of these guys who I'm talking about, who are also former British officers, they're from the north. And the belief here of Congress is, if we want a continental army, and right now our army is sort of northern focused, right? Then we need some southern leadership to sort of unite this thing, to make this truly continental. So George Washington's chosen for his experience, but he's also chosen because of where he's from, to try to get Southerners to support this Continental Army. All right, now the same day that Congress met to begin with, May 10th, the same day the Americans captured the British fort of Fort Ticonderoga. If you remember from our lesson on the French and Indian War, you would know that Fort Ticonderoga was at one point a French fort, and the British captured it. They renamed it Fort Ticonderoga, and this is in New York. So this happens in New York. It's kind of a frontier fort, but the Americans capture it. Now it's not really a battle. The Americans sort of sneak in the middle of the night and take the fort, which you kind of see depicted here in this image. So they really take the fort without a fight. They use stealth to take this fort. But this is significant for a couple of reasons. All right. One, the guy who took the fort was Benedict Arnold. But Benedict Arnold was working with another American named Ethan Allen. And Ethan Allen was the commander of a militia known as the Green Mountain Boys. So technically, Benedict Arnold was the higher ranking officer, but Ethan Allen was the commander of the militia that they were using to take the fort. And these men were loyal to Allen. And so there's a little bit of a dispute after they capture this fort, because you can imagine this is a great victory for the Americans. But there's a little bit of a dispute over who should get the credit. Should Ethan Allen get the credit, or should Benedict Arnold get the credit? That doesn't seem that important now, but it will be important later, especially if you know what ends up happening with Benedict Arnold. So just remember that little seed right there, that Arnold feels disrespected and underappreciated for taking this fort. Now, this next part down here, it says the invasion of Quebec. And if you notice, that lasts a long time. We're just going to mention it here and get it out of the way. The capture of Fort Ticonderoga sets the stage for the invasion of Quebec. So the Americans are actually going to invade Canada. They sort of have the expectation that because now Canada is part of the American colonies, and they think that maybe the people in Canada will rise up to help the Americans and join the American cause, and they do not. And so the invasion of Quebec actually ends in a failure. It's a British victory. The other thing that's important about Fort Ticonderoga, and it's not listed here, but I'll mention it and we'll see it later. The fort has cannons. British forts would have cannons in them. And so by taking this fort, Americans are going to have cannons, and we will see later what happens with those cannons, because they play a pretty important role. Hey guys, I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. There was a weird error with the recording on this slide, so we're starting back. I'm not sure what the last thing I said was that got recorded. So I'm just gonna, this may sound weird, but I'm letting you know why. So we're just gonna jump in like I haven't said anything about this yet. So back in Massachusetts, I think we would have just talked about Fort Ticonderoga. So back in Massachusetts, we're going to have a battle called the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now, everyone calls this the Battle of Bunker Hill. I have put here the Battle of Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill because the majority of the fighting actually takes place on Breed's Hill. These are two hills that are sort of side by side. So I've just put both names here so it'll make sense. I want you to notice the date, June 17, 1775. If you remember, George Washington was given command of the Army, and the Army was created June 14th, 1775. So, on that note, George Washington is not here. He's not at this battle because he's just been given command. Um, and this army, the American army here, while it is technically the Continental Army, it's no different than it was 3 days before. It's the same men who fought at Lexington and Concord, so they haven't received any training or equipment or anything like that that they wouldn't have had. Basically, all they've received is a new name, which is the Continental Army. Now, the commander here, the British commander, is William Howe, and he is important because he is going to basically be the commander of the British forces in America for a while. All right, we will eventually replace him. We will cover that later. Just think of William Howe as sort of the main guy in the British Army in the early part of the American War for Independence. Now, he's not technically in charge here. There's actually a guy over him named Thomas Gage, but he's not going to be around very long, and Howe's the guy actually leading the attack. So just think of William Howe as the commander. So the purpose of this is for Britain to basically retake Boston, and to do that they need to take this high ground of Reed's Hill and Bunker Hill. And so the Americans are fortified on top of the hills. They've dug trenches and things like that, and the British are going to attack. Now, British confidence, they believe that these rebels have no chance of standing against them. And so their tactics are basically to just make a frontal assault, just to charge up the hill with their bayonets. And so they attempt this. The British charge the hill. Now, you've probably heard that the Americans famously said, "Do not shoot until you see the whites of their eyes." That's true. They said that. At least one of them did. There were also, the Americans had set markers. Other American officers had stuck markers in the ground and said, "Don't fire until they get past this mark." And the reason for that is these guns that they're using back then are fairly slow to load. They're not very accurate either. So they knew the British would want to charge them with bayonets. And so they were basically holding their fire until the British were close enough that they could lay the most devastating volley of fire that they could and hope to break the British line. And so that's exactly what happens. The British go marching up the hill, and when they get to that point that the Americans are told to fire, the Americans fire, and it does break the British line. The British retreat, and they go back down to the bottom. At the bottom, they are reformed. Their officers sort of regroup them and send them up the hill a second time. So the second time, the British advance up the hill, the Americans fire, it breaks the British lines, the British run back down the hill again. All right, so the British are at the bottom of the hill, they reform, they reset, they start going up the hill a third time, okay? Now, the problem is the Americans are undersupplied. And so the Americans fire this third volley, but that's really all of their ammo. They're now out of ammo, and so they fire the third volley, and then the Americans retreat. They pull back, and so Britain takes the hills. Okay. Now, in 18th century warfare, there was the understanding that taking the hill or taking the land, right? When you win the field, the battlefield, that you won the battle. So the British here take the hills. They take the field, therefore they won the battle. This is a British victory. Bunker Hill is a British victory. However, this is a Pyrrhic victory. The term Pyrrhic victory refers to the idea that the cost of winning a battle is so great that it's almost like losing the battle. Trying to take these hills, the British lose over 1,000 men, either killed or wounded. This is a significant number of casualties for 18th century warfare. Another British general, Henry Clinton, he said a few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America. He's basically saying winning battles like this is going to lose us the war. So even though this is technically a British victory and that they took the hills, they lost so great a number of men that they can't really do anything after that. And so the Americans are still able to sort of maintain the siege that they already had. So the siege of Boston is going to continue, minus these hills being under American control. It also sort of shows the Americans that they can stand up to the British. And so the British are going to have to be a little more careful next time in fighting their battles. All right. So shortly after the battles at Bunker Hill and Breeds Hill, um, Congress again is still meeting. Congress is going to be together during the war, the whole war. There is an attempt by Congress to reconcile with Great Britain. And so Congress drafts a document called the Olive Branch Petition. If you're familiar, Olive Branch means peace. And so Congress wants to make peace with Great Britain. They want to reconcile. This document is primarily written by a man named John Dickinson, but pretty much any document we talk about here is really written by a committee. So there's a primary author, but there's other people advising him on what to write. Now look at the date, because I want to make a point of the date here, July 5th, 1775. On July 5th, 1775, we are attempting to make peace with Great Britain based on the fact that we are loyal to Britain. We want to keep our relationship with Great Britain and be part of the British Empire. We want to end the fighting. This is significant because on July 4th, 1776, we'll have another document that says something completely different. Obviously, we'll get to that later. But here, July 5th, 1775, Olive Branch Petition, we are trying to make peace. And so we say, hey, we're still loyal to Britain. We don't want to fight anymore. We simply want better treatment when it comes to trade and taxes. All right, so they're again saying, hey, we're fighting, because of some of the things that have happened over the last few years. But we want to ultimately have peace with Britain and sort of reestablish ourselves as British colonists. The king, which is King George III, he rejects this. He says no. In fact, he uses this to declare the Americans to be rebels, to be traitors, and basically that they will be punished when this is all over, said and done. Now, the very next day, July 6th, 1775, another guy, Thomas Jefferson, and again with a committee, writes the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. Basically, Jefferson is pointing out that we have taken up arms against the crown because of these reasons. And one of the things he mentions that's important to understand, he says, in defense of the freedom that is our birthright. All right, Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, he was a student of the Enlightenment, and he believed in the Enlightenment idea of natural rights, that people are born with certain rights. And so he's saying here that a lot of the things that have happened in America are a violation of our God-given rights, our birthright, all right, the rights we were born with. And so that's why we've had to take up weapons, all right? So they're not fighting for independence yet. They're just saying, hey, we want to be part of Great Britain, but we've got some problems, and this is why we're doing what we're doing, all right? So keep in mind, in less than a year, just slightly less than a year, we'll see Thomas Jefferson again, and he'll have a new declaration. And hopefully you already know what that is, but if not, we'll find it out. All right. So meanwhile, back to Boston. All right. So the siege of Boston's been going on all the way since Lexington and Concord, and it will eventually get resolved in March of 1776. So we're moving forward in time a little bit. by this point, George Washington has arrived in Boston. He has taken charge of the Continental Army. They've organized themselves a little bit better. And so he has a plan for what to do with Boston. So Washington, if you remember, we talked a few slides ago about Fort Ticonderoga. And I mentioned that one of the things that was important about Fort Ticonderoga was that it gave the Americans cannons. All right, when we captured the fort, we also captured the British cannons that were in the fort. And so George Washington says, I need those cannons here in Boston. And so he's going to send one of his generals, a man named Henry Knox, all right, to Fort Ticonderoga, which, if you remember, this is in New York, okay? This is in New York. He says, go to Fort Ticonderoga, get these cannons, and bring them here to Boston to me. So Henry Knox leaves. This is in November of 75, so late fall 75. Henry Knox goes to New York. They get the cannons, and they have to bring these cannons to Boston basically in the middle of winter. Some of these cannons weigh, thousands of pounds. They're crossing icy rivers, they're crossing icy lakes, and this is a task. This is a significantly difficult task, but Henry Knox pulls it off. Henry Knox is considered to be the father of American artillery, and there is a fort, you've probably heard of Fort Knox, named after him. But he brings these cannons to George Washington, and George Washington takes these cannons and he puts them on the Dorchester Heights. Now, the Dorchester Heights is another set of hills outside of Boston that the Americans still control. To this point, the Americans have besieged Boston, but they haven't had the means to really attack the British. Once they put these cannons on the Dorchester Heights and Britain realizes these cannons are there, Britain realizes that George Washington now has the tactical advantage, and they withdraw. So this siege of Boston, now that has lasted, almost a year, ends with an American victory. George Washington has basically beaten the British out of Boston. And so the British get on ships and they retreat and they sail to Nova Scotia, which, as you know, is in Canada. And so George Washington's driven the British out. It's a big victory, and everybody's excited about it. Okay, now that's for this video. That's pretty much where we still got a lot to talk about, but we're not going to talk anymore about battles or anything like that. We will in later videos, but we had to mention basically to get to this point. So to this point, things have gone fairly well. George Washington has ran the British out of Boston. Things seem to be going well. We will see what happens with that, all right? But again, this is March of 76. Now, that same year, in January of 76, there was a pamphlet published called Common Sense. Pamphlets at this time were sort of the main type of publication that's circulated around. Books are expensive, pamphlets are cheap. And so people read a lot of pamphlets, and this one was widely circulated. In fact, this is considered to be the best-selling American title of all time. People are still buying this and reading this today. It's still in print. Okay, it's an important document. What it did was it advocated for American independence. So in 1776, there is this document going around that lots of people are reading that is saying, it makes sense that the Americans should rule themselves. They should not be ruled by an island on the other side of the ocean. America should rule itself. So now Americans are discussing independence. They're talking about independence. It gets the conversation going about maybe we should rule ourselves. All right, now this document, Common Sense, it was written by a man named Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was born in England. He's English born, and he's now an American. But he was a student of the Enlightenment. So like Thomas Jefferson, he believes in these ideas of self-government and natural rights and things like that. And he's incorporating that into this essay that he wrote called Common Sense that people are reading. And of course, people are reading, people are talking about it. This is going to get Congress talking about it. And so Congress says, hey, maybe we should have independence. And so Congress votes on it. They have to draw up a document sort of explaining what's going on. And so that document is the Declaration of Independence, which is famously written by Thomas Jefferson. So we've already mentioned Jefferson being a student of the Enlightenment, and this shows in the Declaration of Independence. So what it does is it basically says, hey, Great Britain, we are no longer seeking peace with you as part of the British Empire. We are no longer part of the British Empire. We are now the United States of America. And so in this document, Jefferson lists why we are going to be an independent nation. In other words, what's our justification? Why are we leaving the British Empire? And so he explains all the problems that we've had with Great Britain. But he also addresses the idea of natural rights. And as a student of the Enlightenment, when he incorporates these things into this document, it doesn't just say, hey, we're leaving Great Britain, but it creates a moral standard for the government that we will try to create. Okay, so for example, it famously says that we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator by certain inalienable rights. And he mentions three. He says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, that might sound familiar because when we talked about John Locke, we mentioned natural rights and life, liberty, and property. Jefferson, being a student of the Enlightenment, clearly had read John Locke before. But the idea that he says all men are created equal, by putting that in the Declaration of Independence, he's stating that this is an American truth. This is something we believe as Americans. And therefore, this is something that we have tried to establish since the Declaration of Independence, okay? So obviously, on July 5th, 1776, every American didn't see every person as equal, okay? We obviously had to sort those things out. We're still sorting those things out. But when he wrote it in the Declaration of Independence, it became part of our identity, all right? It's part of what we strive to be, all right? So this is part of that bigger picture. This is part of that, hey, this was more than a war for independence. This was a revolution, all right? So that idea that all men were created equal is pretty significant. All right, so the Congress votes, and it votes for independence. So we are now fighting not for benign neglect, but we are fighting for independence. Now, just because Congress said that we're doing it doesn't mean everybody agrees with it. All right, so what we end up with post Declaration of Independence is a divided country. All right, a divided populace. So those people who are loyal to Great Britain, we're going to call those people loyalists, right? So they're against the idea of independence. They're also known as Tories. But the loyalists, for the most part, are wealthy people. Not always, okay? There's poor people who are loyalists. There's other people that are loyalists that we will talk about, all right? There's exceptions. To anything, there's exceptions. But as a general rule, loyalists are wealthy. The reason behind that is that typically people who are wealthy seem to fit well into the system that is there, right? The system is working for them. So a wealthy person would not want to challenge the system because the system that is currently in place works to their advantage, right? So there's lots of wealthy loyalists. Now, the people who want independence are patriots, sometimes called the Whigs, and the British would refer to them as rebels. But there's some wealthy patriots too. Thomas Jefferson, the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence, is very wealthy. All right, but the patriots seem to be represented across all the social spectrum. There's also a lot of people who just want to be neutral. They just like want to live their life and do the best thing that they can for themselves and their family. Unfortunately for them, they're going to get wrapped up in the war because the war is going to be happening around them. For the American Indians, all right, we can't overlook them. They are an important part of, American history, and they are tied up in this war for independence as well. So just like the white population, there's division among American Indians. A lot of them decide to side with Great Britain, especially when you consider the fact that Britain was trying to keep the American expansion limited to east of the Appalachian Mountains. But there are some pro-American Indians as well that side with the Americans. Now, a lot of these are based in traditional rivalries. So these Indians may have been traditionally rivals with other Indian groups. So if that Indian group sides with Britain, this Indian group sides with the Americans, and that's understandable. But there is some division too, where Indian groups are actually split over this. You can see a few here in these tribes listed. For example, you see Micmacs on both sides. But more importantly, if you remember who our Iroquois Confederacy is, you'll notice nations from the Iroquois Confederacy in both groups. So let's take a closer look at that example, all right? The Iroquois Confederacy. So as we know, the Iroquois Confederacy is, at this point in time, the Six Nations. Out of the Six Nations, 4 of them seem to be pro-British, and they're going to fight for the British. A lot of this is primarily because of a Mohawk leader named Joseph Brant. Joseph Brant he's a Mohawk warrior. He has familial ties to the British Empire. And his argument is that the Mohawks have always been allies of Britain. We go all the way back to the Pequot War, and we saw, that was England. It wasn't Britain yet, but they helped the English, and then in King Philip's War and King William's War and things like that. So he believes it is in the best interest of his people to side with Britain. And so the Mohawks, the Cayugas, the Senecas, the Onondagas follow in that example. They go, yeah, we're going to be on the British side. But 2 of the Iroquois nations, of the 6 nations, join with the Americans. And these 2 nations are the Oneidas and the Tuscaroras. And their siding with the Americans is primarily thanks to the works of a man named Samuel Kirkland. Samuel Kirkland was an American missionary who lived among the Oneidas, and he had convinced them to side with the Americans. And so, unfortunately for the Iroquois Confederacy, which was probably the most powerful Indian group in North America, significantly, a very important Native American group, becomes divided over this war. Our war for independence really sort of destroys their confederacy, which is unfortunate. We will talk more about this later, so we're not done talking about this. We'll talk more about this later when we talk about some of the other battles. And then we have the black population, and so we've talked about the whites a little bit. We talked about the Indians, and we talked about the blacks. So again, we have to look at, there's the unique situation that black Americans are in during this war. A lot of them are enslaved. A lot of them are free. Free black persons can sort of choose which side to be on. Enslaved black persons cannot choose. They're going to be supporting the side that basically their master is on, because their master is whatever they support. All right, then the slaves' labor will support that. And if the master is neutral, then they're not really supporting either. But there is some interesting things that we have to talk about. So one of them is called Dunmore's Proclamation. John Murray, the Lord of Dunmore, he was the governor of Virginia. He's a royal governor, so he's appointed by the king, so clearly he is loyal to the king. when this rebellion happens, all right, the American War for Independence, he makes this proclamation that any slave who joins the British service will have their freedom. Now, we kind of mentioned this before when we talked about the governor of Florida and Fort Mose and all that. It's easy for us today to look at something like slavery that we sort of agree. Like today, for the most part, hopefully we all agree that slavery is bad, right? Our society says slavery is morally wrong. So then we look at something like Dunmore's proclamation, where this man says, hey, I'm offering slaves freedom. It's real easy for us to look at that and say, oh, this guy's on the right side of history. But history's complex, okay? Dunmore is the governor of Virginia. Virginia's economy depends on slavery. So just because he's offering freedom to slaves does not make him anti-slavery. It makes him anti-American Revolution. He's against the rebellion, and he knows that offering slaves their freedom is a means to suppressing that rebellion. Because if slaves join the British service, obviously Britain is gaining soldiers, they're gaining laborers, and if they're leaving pro-American, if they're leaving patriot plantations, then it's hurting those plantations. So there's other motives to it, right? But if I'm a slave, I may not care about the motivation. If I'm a slave and this person's offering me freedom, that might be enough of a motivation to get me to go to that side. And so lots of slaves are going to escape to join the British service. And we call these black loyalists, that's what we call them, black loyalists, specifically black loyalists. And they do a lot of things. They do, depending on what skills they have, if they worked for a blacksmith, they may perform blacksmith duties in the British Army. They may be soldiers in the British Army. There's a variety of things they could do in the British service. Two famous examples of black loyalists are Thomas Peters and Boston King. That's actually Thomas Peters there in that picture in the red jacket. Both of these men ended up, after the war, going to Canada, and eventually Britain creates a colony in Africa for these black loyalists to go to leave North America and go to Africa. But these two men, we know who they are because they left written accounts. There's lots of obvious, black loyalists who were former slaves that didn't leave written accounts. But we know these two men. And others. There's others we know too. These are just two examples. And then you have black patriots, right? Black people who support the American cause. One of them famously is Phyllis Wheatley. And I'm sure most of you have heard of her. When I was a kid back in school, we learned about Phyllis Wheatley in probably, third grade. But Phyllis Wheatley was a poet. She wrote poetry. She was technically a slave. She was a slave in Boston. And that's important to point out because sometimes we fall into the idea that only the southern states had slaves, and that's not true. There was slavery in all of the American states. But Phyllis Wheatley did not die a slave. She was actually given her freedom because of her master bought into the ideology of the American Revolution. So this is part of that bigger picture thing. Earlier I mentioned that the Declaration of Independence said all men are created equal. So people who are on this revolutionary side, people who are fighting for this cause might read that and say, well, if all men are created equal, what am I doing owning slaves? And they would get rid of them. And that did happen. Lots of people got rid of their slaves as a result of that declaration. Now, a lot of people didn't. A lot of people saw no contradiction. It's hard for us to comprehend, but they saw no contradiction in fighting for freedom and the idea that all men are created equal, and at the same time owning slaves. Not a problem, right? Thomas Jefferson, the man that wrote it, he was a slave owner. But the other black loyalists that I've listed here, and again, these are just two examples, but these are examples to sort of prove a point. The other guy here is Billy Lee. If you look at this slide and you go, okay, well, I know that guy's Thomas Peters because he told me that was Thomas Peters, and that other guy's George Washington. But if you look behind George Washington, you should see a black guy back there. That's Billy Lee. So Billy Lee, his actual name's William Lee, but he went by Billy Lee. He was George Washington's valet, and what that meant was this was like his personal slave. Now, George Washington had lots of slaves. George Washington was a plantation owner. So George Washington had hundreds of slaves at home on his plantation, but Billy Lee was like the slave that accompanied him everywhere, right? The one who was his personal servant. Now, why does that matter? Well, George Washington is the father of our country. He fought the British, and he ultimately is going to win. If you didn't know he was going to win, spoiler alert, but he wins. But that also means that Billy Lee did all that stuff. When Washington was on the battlefield, Billy Lee was on the battlefield. Billy Lee is an American hero, just like George Washington's an American hero. Now, interesting thing about Billy Lee. So Billy Lee gets his freedom for the same reason Phyllis Wheatley did. George Washington believed in it, and he gave Billy Lee his freedom. So neither of these, Phyllis Wheatley nor Billy Lee, died a slave. But on that note, okay, there's a lot of people today who will look at somebody like George Washington and they'll say, oh man, this guy's great. He's the father of our country. We should celebrate him. But then they will try to hide the fact that he was a slave owner. And then you have another group of people today who will point out the fact that George Washington was a slave owner, and therefore try to discredit him for everything that he did positively for our nation. And the truth is, both of those are the wrong approach to history. George Washington can be the father of our country, who is deserving of a lot of celebration, and at the same time have been a slave owner, which today we morally, condemn. We say, hey, slavery is bad. What we have to be careful about is understanding that our values today, the thing today that tells us that slavery is bad, didn't necessarily exist then, okay? If we project our modern day values and opinions onto people of the past, we can make an error in studying history. It would be incomprehensible if the President of the United States today owned a bunch of slaves. We would just say, hey, that doesn't make any sense. That's illegal. It's wrong, etc., etc., etc. Okay? In 1776, for a wealthy white man in Virginia to own several hundred slaves, it was not seen as wrong. No matter how we look at it today, that was normal for the time. So when we look at somebody like Washington, we need to look at the whole person of George Washington, but we got to be careful and understand them for the time in which they exist. The fact that George Washington gave Billy Lee his freedom is important because it kind of helps demonstrate that idea that the American Revolution is changing things, because the idea that all men are created equal is important. Now, some people will say, yeah, but what about all of his other slaves? And some people will say, yeah, well, he freed them too. Well, he technically did and he technically didn't. George Washington had made a proclamation that on his wife's death, his slaves would go free. He died before his wife. So the only slave he freed in his lifetime was Billy Lee. The rest were not freed until his wife died, which was after him. But just the act of understanding that things were changing is part of what makes this revolutionary. All right, now the last thing that we'll talk about in this video, and then we'll get back to the battles and all that in the next video, is women. Women obviously fall into all these categories. You know, there's white women, black women, American Indian women, and they, fall into their categories, and they're going to be the same way. They're going to be divided. Some of them are going to support the British side, some are going to support the American side. A lot of them are just going to try to stay neutral and do what's best, right? But as far as their role in the war, all right, a lot of women served in the war as camp followers, so this would apply to either side. Basically, what they did was they followed the army, and they provided, services like nurses. They were cooks, they were laundresses, so they could wash clothes, sew clothes. They took care of the army, either side. All right. Now, as far as women soldiers went, there were not a lot of women soldiers. This was, that would have been very rare. There are a few examples that are notable, but they're notable for their rarity. So, for example, Mary Ludwig Hayes, she's the woman that most people think of as Molly Pitcher, who was basically running water to the battlefield, and her husband got hurt, and so she started manning the cannon. That is a notable example, but it is an exception. Another one is Deborah Sampson. Deborah Sampson served in the Continental Army, but she did so as a man. She was presenting as a man, so they thought she was a guy until she had to have some medical treatment, and obviously the doctor, when he treated her, realized this is not a man, this is a woman, and so upon finding this out, she was discharged and all that. She ends up getting married, having kids, and all this kind of stuff, and is later sort of celebrated for the fact that, she was such a patriot that she disguised herself to fight. But again, she's an exception. There were women who were used as spies. Washington had an exceptional spy network, and women played a role in this because the enemy didn't expect women. So women played an important role as spies, especially for the American Army. But a big part of women were serving as mothers, because as men are fighting this war, somebody's got to take care of the home. Somebody's got to take care of the family. Somebody's got to make sure the kids are fed. And that job fell on women. And so that's an important role that we shouldn't overlook. All right, so we're going to stop here. The next video, we will pick up with the battles, all right, and kind of look at what's going on there. We've, as of this point, things have gone pretty good for the Americans, but as we will see, that's going to take a turn, and things will be going very badly for the Americans in the next video. All right, so I hope you found this interesting, and thanks again.